Good afternoon, and thank you for coming to today's panel. My name is Araceli Tinajero, and I am professor of Hispanic Literatures here at the Graduate Center and at the City College of New York. The Mexico Study Group began back in about 11 years ago, back in 2008. Since then, we had panels on technology and culture in 20th century Mexico, the Mexican digital libraries, Mexico and Asia, Mexican democracy and migration, the Mexico 2018 elections, urbanization in Mexico, the US-Mexico border, and Mexico and Brazil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we had a lot of panels. And all the panels were very successful, and today's is not an exception. Today's panel, Infrastructure and Environment in Mexico City, will discuss cases of infrastructural projects in Mexico City. We have two panelists today, and I don't know if you received this pamphlet. This gives you information about the panel and also about the two panelists. Part of the following questions will be answered by the two panelists, and one of them is, what has been the role of the environment in the policy process around each infrastructural project? And some other questions that are here in the introduction to the panel. So the first panelist is David Lopes, a Mexican student in the Public and Urban Policy program at the New School. More information about his research is right here, so you may read it and take it with you. So please help me welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Araceli, for organizing this panel. Thank you to the Bildner Center for having us, for being the host today. And thank you, Oscar, also for participating in this panel. As Araceli was mentioning, I'm David Lopes, a PhD candidate from the New School in the Public and Urban Policy PhD program. And I'm also an adjunct faculty at the Urban Studies Department at Queens College, so I feel at home being here. And it's my pleasure to be here with you today. So what I'm going to present today is called the Mexico City's Metrobus policy process. Metrobus is a specific public transit infrastructure, the role of environmental expertise. And I got to start by saying that this presentation, it's a byproduct of my doctoral work, because I went to Mexico City to do my field work in the fall of 2018, and my dissertation is about the relationship between access to economic opportunities and access to public transport in Mexico City on a metropolitan scale. But while researching transit infrastructures in Mexico City, it came to my attention and it struck me that environmental knowledge and environmental expertise was playing such an important role in the planning of transit infrastructure. So along with a colleague from the University of Guadalajara, we decided to take this little detour in my work to write a paper about it. And that's what I'm gonna present today. First, some context. Mexico City is in the center, this big metropolitan area at the city center of the country. That's Mexico City. It's a tri-state area comprised of 76 different municipalities, home of over 22 million people, and the economic engine of the country, right? The entire Mexican economy has historically been centered in Mexico City, so it's a pretty important city in our country and in the history of our urbanization. The city center is around those municipalities with a 1 and with a 5. That's where the main economic activity of the city is located, and people live in the peripheral area, and usually they have to commute to the city center if people want to engage in the main economic activity. So a trip to work in Mexico City could take 2 hours, 2.5 hours each way for people to participate in the main economic activity of the city. So transit infrastructure is a big deal in Mexico City inhabitants' daily life, right? And very soon in the process of my research, I saw that the transit system of Mexico City is very complex. It's comprised of many kinds of infrastructures. Some of them are completely publicly owned, completely subsidized, and very affordable for Mexico City people, but others are privately owned, running on a system of concessions, and they're more expensive for people. And I saw that there's an uneven distribution of these kind of infrastructures across the space, right? Some parts of the city are going to be very well connected with a lot of publicly owned transit systems, whereas other areas of the city are going to be left for private systems, right? People will rely on the private systems and they have to pay more. So a question that I decided to push a little bit forward was, well, what are the underlying forces behind which of the infrastructures are going to go to which of the spaces, right? Why is it that some spaces of the city have these kind of public infrastructures with a strong presence of the state in providing the service of public transit, whereas other areas are left to the private sector, right? Or concession systems that are privately run. So in pushing that agenda further, I decided to use a couple of research approaches. One of them is the public action framework, and the other one is the policy narratives framework. And I want to explain them very briefly and then show you the research design that I did and then show you some findings, all right? I made some notes about this theoretical framework, so let me just read them very quickly. Put forward by Sciences Po professors Pierre Lascombs and Patrick Legalet, the sociology of public action calls for a broader understanding of the social forces shaping the role of the state in facing public problems. The concept of public action refers not only to the actions of the state, but also to the activities of other non-governmental stakeholders that have an influence in the policy process, such as non-governmental organizations, community organizations, political movements, and so forth. In this way, the public action framework invites scholars to look at both the governmental and non-governmental efforts in the shaping of three interacting components or three outcomes, those over there. The shared understanding of the shared understanding of the nature of public problems and its solutions, the broader societal agreement on the role of the state and other actors in facing those problems, and the institutionalization of solutions through public policies. The public action framework relies on the analysis of 5 interacting variables, these 5 variables over here. Actors with different interests, strategies, and resources operate within their institutional frameworks to bring their own representations of public problems into the policy process. This takes form in processes of mobilization, coalition building, and conflict, which ultimately generates outputs, the policies, and generates outcomes, social change. The challenge lies in that this shared understanding of public problems and its corresponding solutions is not a given. Following Professors Lascombs and Legalet, public problems do not just exist by themselves. Instead, public problems have to be socially constructed and politically negotiated. Public problems have to be selected and configured. Viewed from this angle, designing public policy is not just taking actions to solve a public problem. It also means to construct the public problem in the first place. Now, an important stream of policy process research is starting to take a closer look at the role of narratives in the shaping of public action. Since the seminal work of Professor Deborah Stone in the late 80s, we acknowledge that in politics, narrative stories are the principal means for defining and contesting policy problems. In the words of Professor Stone, problem definitions are stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end, involving some change or transformation. they have heroes and villains and innocent victims, and they pit the forces of evil against the forces of good. Stories provide explanations for how the world works. These explanations are often unspoken, widely shared, and so much taken for granted that we aren't even aware of them. They can hold a powerful grip on our imaginations and our psyches because they offer the promise of resolution for scary problems. More recently, scholars like Elizabeth Shanahan, Michael Jones, and Mark Macbeth developed a formal research method to study the influence of narratives in the policy process. The method has been called the narrative policy framework, and it consists of the empirical analysis of narratives in terms of their content and their form. The study of narrative form means identifying and describing its components, which includes the characters, the setting, the plot, and the moral of the narrative story. The study of narrative content means identifying the elements that infuse meaning to the narratives to create policy realities. The content of the narrative includes the study of belief systems and the narrative strategies employed by the characters to influence the policy process. This empirical strategy allows to connect the study of narratives with other theories of the policy process like the advocacy coalition framework, the multiple streams framework, the policy feedback theory, institutional analysis and development framework, policy diffusion models, and so on, all right? So the purpose of this is to study empirically narratives to connect that to other theories of the policy process. With this framework in mind, I went to the field in Mexico City to research the role of narratives in the shaping of public action in regard to public transport. I spent the fall of 2018 doing a research stay at UNAM and the spring break and summer of 2019 doing follow-up field research. I set up to study the narratives of 3 points in time that are key in the shaping of public action in regard to public transport in Mexico City. The first point in time is around 1995, with the bankruptcy and privatization of the state-owned bus company Ruta 100. Created in 1981 and working until 1995 in Mexico City, we had a state-owned bus company that was declared in bankruptcy by the mayor, and it was privatized in 1995. So that moment is key to understanding the shape of public action. The second point in time is around 2005, with the appearance of a public-private partnership for the creation of the first bus rapid transit system in the city called Metrobus, a BRT, that's a bus rapid transit line that runs through iconic Insurgentes Avenue, connecting the north with the south of the city. The third point in time is our present days, during the time that my fieldwork was taking place. Now, the empirical evidence for the study of narratives in 1995 and 2005 was collected from newspaper articles of that time. In total, I collected 89 newspaper articles containing the narratives related to the bankruptcy of Ruta 100 and 52 newspaper articles related to the appearance of Metrobus. To gather data about the present-day narratives, I conducted in-depth interviews with 29 key informants that are currently participating in the public transport policy subsystem. Now, we are processing this data with the help of 4 great research assistants from the University of Guadalajara and a team that was assembled through the support of my co-author, civil society organization called Transversal Think Tank. We had to assemble this research team because the method specifies that the analysis of narratives has to be done by independent coders. It cannot be us as authors because we could bias the analysis, so it has to be done by independent coders to keep this as objective as possible. I'm still in the process of coding the data and educating ourselves on the lessons that can be drawn from it. However, we have finished coding the 52 newspaper articles from the Metrobus policy process around 2005, right, 2005. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. I cannot stress enough that this is work in progress and that any feedback you could provide to me during this session is going to be extremely helpful, all right, to shape how we're going to move forward with this article. So this is what we're studying. This is what I'm going to present now, the 52 newspaper articles of this moment here, right? The creation of the Metrobus, this public transit system that it's a bus rapid transit system. The policy process, we located somewhere between 1999 and 2005. It was a long-spanning policy process and a lot of political dispute. But at the end of it, the system was able to be implemented, and it continues to be implemented and built until today. That bus over there is from line 7. We're now in line 7, and the city is actually building line 8, and they're substituting these kind of buses over here. Bus owners of these kind of concession buses they create a public-private partnership with the city to create lines of BRT, of Metrobus, where the private bus owners own the buses, and the city puts the infrastructure, the stations, and the dedicated lanes for running the system. And even though we're in line 7 now, this analysis is about the creation of the first line, right, of line 1. The policy process, the narratives in the policy process to create line 1, which goes about from 1999 to 2005. So let me show you some results of what we have found so far from the narratives, right? This is the kind of actors that are engaged in the conversation. And if you look at the first 3 categories, 57% of the actors engaged in the conversation are experts. Experts from environmental studies, with almost 29%, experts from urban development, or experts from academia. It came to our attention that, for instance, government transport agencies, only 7% of the actors are belonging to this category, or experts in transport, only 2.4, right? So this was weird because we were expecting that more experts in transportation and people from transport government agencies were engaged in the conversation. But to our surprise, it's 57% of people and actors engaged in this conversation are experts from this field. Now, who are the villains in this story? The villains, it's the Mexico City government itself, with 51% of mentions. Concession bus system, the owners of private buses that provide the service, the concession bus service, they're villains, and also the private automobiles, they're also villains. And they're villains in the sense that, and here are some excerpts from some of the newspapers, right, to illustrate the narratives on the villains. They're villains in the sense that private automobiles are creating a lot of pollution and creating a lot of urban health problems, and as well as the concession buses. But concession buses have a lot of resistance for change, and the government is implementing the wrong policies, right? The government is a villain because Mexico City government is building infrastructure for private cars, and it's not able to regulate concession bus systems, so they're the villains, right? They're doing the wrong set of policies. Now, who are the victims? The victims are, above all, Mexico City inhabitants as a whole, right? The environment is also a victim, and public transport uses, they're also a victim in this narrative. And how is that happening? Because all of this pollution by private automobiles and the concession buses that are old and then pollute a lot, they're poisoning the air, and therefore inhabitants as a whole are paying the consequences, and they're being damaged in their health, right? That's how the narrative goes. Now, who are the heroes? To our surprise, the heroes are also Mexico City government, right? So that's surprising that Mexico City government is at the same time the villain, but it's also the hero. Look at the definition of the hero, according to this narrative policy framework. Those who take action with purpose to achieve or oppose. Sorry. Okay, no, that's wrong. I'm sorry. Just disregard that. So the heroes are those that can bring a solution, right, to the problem. And well, Mexico City government is a hero, and also Metrobus is a hero as well, right? So the system itself that was under dispute in all this policy process is also a hero. That was weird, but it actually makes sense because that connects to other discussions and other studies that maybe Oscar can talk more about it because he has researched this extensively, of policy diffusion. So the Metrobus system, this bus rapid transit system, has traveled and it's been imported to Mexico City. It was very successful first in Brazil, then it traveled to Bogota, and from there it traveled to other cities in the region. And this speaks about policy entrepreneurs. In the jargon of policy process, we call it policy entrepreneurs. That's actors that have a solution waiting just for the right opportunity to push their preferred solution to the problems, right? So the fact that Metrobus is a hero in itself makes sense when we put it in the larger context of the conversation of policy diffusion of this kind of transit infrastructures across the region. International cooperation agencies is also a hero because they can fund. They have the technical expertise and they fund these kind of infrastructures. Here are some excerpts of the kind of narratives and the heroes. Now, the Mexico City government could become a hero if they start to implement the right policies, right? Stop building infrastructure for private vehicles, regulate public transit, and modernize public transit, and bring these new infrastructures that have proven successful in other places, and therefore they can be heroes. Now, the morals. The moral of the story in the narrative policy framework is usually the solution that is proposed, right, in the narrative. And it's usually a call for action. Maybe you can read this, otherwise I'll read it for you. The solution, the moral that has more mentions is investing in high quality public transport. And the second one is overcome private interest and focus on public interest, right? So if you look at the narratives of the moral, it is a narrative of overcoming private interest from bus companies, concession bus companies, in the to favor public interest, and it's also a story of users of private vehicles shifting, letting their car in their house and shifting to public transport systems, right? But that needs high quality public transport in order to achieve that people move into public transport systems. Now, the beliefs is the values or the beliefs that orient individual, group, and coalitions in societies. And when we analyze the beliefs in the narratives, we found that those that have the most recurring mentions are improving urban health, right? Most of interventions of people participating in the narrative is based on the value of improving urban health, improving quality of life, and improving the environment. That's motivating their engagement in the policy process, and you can see it in some of the excerpts from some narratives, right? Here's like a causal relationship in between lines. The causal relationship that if the government is able to invest in high quality public transport and we're able to overcome private interest to favor public interest, people will stop using the car, we will increase the quality of public transport, which in turn will create less pollution and therefore a better urban health, right? So that was the narrative that was being put. So in summary, we see that actors are above all experts in the environmental field and in urban development. Mexico City government is at the same time a villain and a hero. Concession buses and private vehicles are also villains in this story, in this narrative. The victims are Mexico City inhabitants as a whole and the environment. And these actors are engaging from the values of improving urban health and improving quality of life. And the solution that was advanced was investing in high-quality public transport and overcome private interest in favor of public interest, right? Now, what are the implications of this study? So we think, my co-author and I, we think that through this study and with this paper, we can make a contribution to, we can use a public framework, the public action framework and the narrative policy framework to make a contribution to governmentality studies. Governmentality studies is a very complex thing that I didn't want to elaborate because that will take like 20 minutes in itself. But it's basically spring from the studies of Foucault, and it's basically the study of the right way to govern, what's right and what's wrong. The right way to govern will exert power and will be able to achieve policy change, right? Whereas the wrong way of govern will create contestation and dispute. So we think we can create contribution to governmentality studies, specifically to the nexus between knowledge and power, right? Governments, in governmentality studies, governments, if they want to have power to achieve things, they have to have the right knowledge that will in Foucauldian terms, he calls them veridiction, right? I don't want to go deeper into that because that's very complex in itself, and it takes a lot of time. But we want to keep researching the nexus between knowledge and power to achieve policy change, because we're seeing that knowledge shifts, right? The knowledge needed to exert power and achieve consensus and implement policies in this time that we're researching between 1999 and 2005 came to environmental experts and urban development experts. The experts had the knowledge, so they engaged in the policy process. We think that before that, knowledge was elsewhere. We're still in the process of analyzing the narratives, but we think that knowledge was elsewhere. Knowledge was more in narratives of government efficiency over the 90s, and it wasn't with the environmental experts, but in this time, it arrived at environmental experts, and we think that it's there until today. Today, we still discuss the problem and the solutions of infrastructural problems in Mexico City in terms of environmental knowledge. Knowledge is a powerful tool for the policy process. Knowledge is defined to shape problems, shape solutions, build coalitions, and create windows of opportunity for policy entrepreneurs. And above all, central state knowledge can overshadow other kind of knowledges, right? Like other discussions in transportation studies, in mobility studies, like social justice, inclusive public transport, transport accessibility, and even gender issues, they could be overshadowed if the prevailing knowledge is centered just around environmental issues, right? That kind of sways the conversation towards the environmental agenda, which is fine in itself, but it's also overshadowing other kind of knowledges that don't find a space in the policy process, all right? I'm going to leave it there for now. I thank you so much for your attention and looking forward for your feedback.
Thank you, David Lopez. Our next speaker is Professor Oscar Sosa. He's visiting assistant professor of policy and social justice at the New School, and he's working on a book. The project is entitled "The Politics of Immediacy: Citizenship, Infrastructure, and Sustainable Mobility in Mexico City." Welcome, welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Professor Tinajero, for the introduction. Thanks, David, for inviting me. Thanks for the Wildner Center and Professor Font and Rosalina and everybody else that helped me get here. I titled my presentation Sustainable Low-Carbon Transportation Policy, Expertise, and Citizenship. Let me see if I can make things a little bit more ergonomic here. And this is part of my ongoing project and a book and some research that I've been conducting for the last several years, looking at and examining the emergence. I'm going to try to keep my own time here. The emergence of sustainable transportation in Mexico City as a distinct policy field. And I'm focusing particularly not so much on the technical effects of a variety of projects, some of which David already mentioned, but also, but mostly thinking about what are the physical and how is it that these projects are affecting or impacting physical and political landscapes in the city. So, for instance, how is it that the emergence of new ways of managing the bus system or as you will see, bicycle infrastructure are actually changing the way in which we think about democracy? How is it that these projects are impacting current and existing and historic patterns of especially inequality and other forms of inequality and difference in the city? In other words, what I'm trying to do with my work is to look at the relationship between transportation policy, sustainable transportation policy, and urban citizenship in Mexico City. And what do I mean by urban citizenship? I'll be very concise. Urban citizenship is a way of understanding the process of construction and contestation of regimes of rights, of belonging and exclusion that manifest in ways that cannot be necessarily understood through the lens of the nation state. So we're refocusing on the actual daily lives at the city level. And thinking about urban citizenship allows us to think, to pay attention to unequal social, political, and technical regimes that shape day-to-day experiences. Urban infrastructures, transportation infrastructure, as David mentioned, and I also touch on briefly, are central to reproducing inequalities in the city. But as I would explain, and David also explained very nicely, urban infrastructures and sustainable transportations have become critical size for different forms of political claims. And why is this important? Why transportation out of all the different aspects of public policy? I'm an urban planner by training, by the way. Why did I choose this? Well, in Mexico City in particular, transportation it's important because Mexico City is a very large and a very unequal city, and transportation it's distributed in different ways. For instance, low income residents are usually commuting for a long time over large distances. In low quality transportation systems, they're spending a lot of their income just getting to work, and the distribution of transportation and other amenities are linked to also housing markets. So what we see is that these two issues compound, and you have poor households having to locate far from jobs and spending more money, and this kind of like reproduces. But there's also a little bit more here about the actual biases of in investment, and just to give you a brief snapshot of this, in Mexico City, 70% of daily trips take place in some form of public transportation. However, 70% of the public monies that go to transportation infrastructure goes to infrastructure that mostly benefits private car owners and drivers, right? So you have a very striking inequality. As many of you might know, and if not, I'll just tell you very briefly, having a car in Mexico City, it's not impossible, but it remains a privilege, if you want to call it that way, although that's not a word we like to use or associate with cars much anymore. It is something that's not attainable for most people who are just relegated to other forms of transportation, whether they want it or not. And because of this and many other reasons, transportation and especially sustainable transportation has been linked to a variety of political projects. Civil society experts, city officials have been arguing since the early 2000s that transforming the way in which the city manages transportation would actually translate into a more sustainable and more democratic city. That changing the patterns of infrastructure investment, changing the modes of transportation that are privileged, would eventually produce certain redistributive effects that would potentially, or in theory, benefit those that are historically have been ignored by policymakers. But also by introducing certain mechanisms, technocratic mechanisms for the planning and the management on transportation, the city would also, and especially the planning offices within the city, are going to produce a more democratic city because of the adoption of different models of citizen engagement, different ways of co-producing transportation plans and projects. Or at least this is the narrative, if we want to use that term again, right? And one thing that's important here, and that I want to focus a lot today, is that this is not necessarily a thing that has happened in isolation. The adoption of sustainable transportation, the focus on sustainable transportation, has also coincided with the solidification of Mexico City as a democracy. If you're familiar with Mexico City's history, for many years the city did not have a way to elect your mayor or any other public officials, and the country as a whole, just in 2000, was able to elect a president from another party than the one that had ruled for 70 years. So what we see here is that there are different ideas and narratives and logics coinciding in transportation policy in Mexico City. Just to give you an example, some of these groups have been able to insert themselves. Some of the groups that I'm going to mention have been able to introduce themselves in policy processes, because now the government is expected to participate in conversations with other actors and other agents before they produce a project. Although, as I would show you, that doesn't happen all the time, right? And another key idea here that I want you to keep in mind is the question, and because this is a talk about the environment, about climate change, right? And what I found, and what many of the actors that I spoke to told me, is that in the 2000s, Mexico City becomes a very important site for experimentation in urban policy around climate change and low carbon transportation, and a lot of civil society actors that had been previously focusing on environmental issues shift their concerns and their agendas and the platforms to embrace the language and the concerns of climate change. And this is important because you go from environmental sustainability as a very local issue to climate change, which is global, and that opens the door to a variety of very interesting actors, which are the actors that I'm gonna be discussing in the remaining of this presentation. So I want you to I'm not gonna go in depth in one single project as David did earlier. Instead, I'm going to give you a snapshot of three different things that I've been looking at. But but if there's something that connects them, there are a couple of things. But one that I want to just discuss briefly are these new actors that I and a colleague of mine have called expert citizens. Again, I just mentioned that in Mexico City there's a shift between thinking of environmental problems of Mexico, which are very famous. Mexico City is infamously one of the most polluted cities in the world, and had that that stigma for a long time. And I'm not saying that it's not polluted anymore, but now it's also known as an innovator in green policy and in low carbon transportation projects. And part of this is because Mexico City became a key site for global climate governance agendas. Since the early 2000s, a variety of actors that were not present in urban politics before arrived in the city. These are actors that are linked to international development, to global philanthropy, and we see foundations and some groups that are able to locate themselves in critical nodes in the process of policy making. One of the most important ones that I'm going to be talking about is ITDP, which is a local agency, the Institute for Transport and Development Policy. It's located in, the main offices are here in New York, but it's an organization that works globally promoting sustainable transportation projects. So these actors are doing a couple of things. First of all, they're introducing, we can link them to what David called the policy entrepreneurs, so we can think of them in that sense. They're introducing a variety of best practices to fix environmental and congestion solutions in Mexico City and in many cities across the world. And they're also promoting reforms, urban reform agendas that involve not just the adoption of one technology or another one, but also institutional reforms to change the management and the governance of the city so that certain projects are able to be implemented and managed more efficiently. They push a lot agendas that call for public-private partnerships, which remain to be very controversial in Mexico, especially in Mexico City, which is at least in discourse, a leftist city with a leftist government, at least for the last 20 years. And they also use a lot of what we call in planning market logic, right? So instead of having government subsidize things, let's let the market fix our problems and take care of the distribution of amenities and services. And these actors are very important. Like I said, they have been able to locate themselves at the center of policymaking. They have become very influential, and they do two things that are very interesting to me, and I hope they're interesting to you too. They are able to mobilize their expertise as international actors. They link to the World Bank, linked to the United Nations, to World Resources Institute, and these groups, to legitimize projects that the government, the city government is promoting when they agree with those projects, right? So if the government wants to change very informal bus systems with a very rationalized public-private partnership, if these actors, such as ITDP, agrees with them, then they'll say, this is the right way to go, and we know because we're experts and we have all this knowledge that we can use. But they also do the opposite. When there are projects that they don't agree with, they'll mobilize not so much their technical expertise, but their position as non-state actors. So they'll say, we're citizens, we're civil society. So we have the capacity of also working as a counterbalance to what a state would like to do. So they can say that they're democratic or they're helping democracy when they're fighting or contesting projects, but they always say that they don't necessarily tell you we're one thing in this occasion and we're another thing in this occasion. This is my analysis, and I'll show you empirically how I see this working out. I'm gonna move a little bit faster because I think I'm running out of time. So, like I said, I'm giving you this very, very, very big picture of how I am characterizing in my work. I have seen this changing landscape of urban politics and citizenship. But I want to give you a few snapshots of actual empirical work that I've done, and this draws from several months and over the last few years of qualitative and ethnographic work, interviewing experts, civil society actors, public officials, attending events, attending informational sessions, going out and joining some groups when they're out there in the street fighting against a project. And like I said, one of the actors that is going to be central to these three stories that I'm going to briefly show you is this ITDP, International Transportation and Development Policy. The Institute for Transportation and Development Policy, an international NGO. And I want us, and the projects, the three projects that I'm going to show you, there are three things that I'm going to touch on. One is how these actors, along with other actors, have had something to do with how the contested definitions of sustainability are mobilized for and against projects. They have participated and in some ways or facilitated the creation of new mechanisms and channels for claims making, for engaging in politics in the city. And you'll see, or at least my take on this is, these actors have also contributed or are linked to the appearance of new forms of exclusion or the reinforcement of existing forms of exclusion and inequality in the city. So again, due to the time constraints of the presentation, I'm going to kind of fly over these three examples. I apologize for that, but I'll be happy to come back and discuss any of them if you feel that they're particularly interesting to you. So the first project is called Supervía Poniente, and Supervía Poniente it's a private toll road that was constructed in Mexico around between 2010 and 2013. I'm going to show you this is a project where contested definitions of sustainable infrastructure were at play that generated opposition to this project. It was highly controversial. Opposition of this project generated broad alliances and social mobilization against privatizing a top-down infrastructure, planned infrastructure. And it generated arguments, and the arguments that were generated were framed in terms of human rights and technical expertise, especially around environmental impact assessment. Very quickly, if you are familiar with Mexico City, Supervía Poniente is a project located in the south, or what is considered the southwest of the city. It links Santa Fe, which is a very famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, central business and residential, high income, high class business and residential area in the city. It links this urban enclave to the rest of the city through, or it aimed, and it actually does, through a toll road that connects it to the peripheral, the city, the urban ring, the double-decker urban highways that David mentioned earlier. This project was very, very controversial because the city defined it as an environmental project because it was going to shorten distances and reduce congestion between two important business centers in the city. So the city said, this is sustainable, right? This is about less cars being stuck in traffic, producing smog and et cetera. But the project itself was going to cut, and it actually cuts through a natural preserve. And it bypasses a low-income neighborhood that is not served by the highway at all. So basically, you have a highway that you cannot use running through the middle of your neighborhood and affecting your sustainable the natural preserves that have been in your background for a long time. And the opposition to this project was constructed around, like I said, discourses of human rights, of the right to the city, and about technical expertise, because what you had here was a coalition of these low-income neighborhood residents in the Magdalena Contreras district in the city, with ITDP, this group that I mentioned, this New York-based sustainable transportation experts, that contested the city government's environmental impact assessment projects, right? So I have here one picture that I took when I went and visited that neighborhood. They are critiquing and the mayor at the time, Marcelo Ebrard, who's going to defend nature if environmental officers work for developers, right? So the people were arguing, the residents were arguing that this was basically a project that was going to benefit the developers of the rich Santa Fe neighborhood more than anybody else, right? But for ITDP, this was about introducing and trying to formalize another way of thinking about transportation as a human right, and a human right that is linked to sustainability and climate change. If we think about transportation as something that could help, sustainable transportation, something that could help us battle climate change. And they went to the Mexico City's Human Rights Commission and developed a report and a definition of what the right to mobility is, that it's based on ideas of sustainability, right? So the project at the end was executed. They were not successful at stopping the construction of this toll road, but they were successful at inscribing the language of the right to mobility if not at this time in the bylaws of the city, at least in the bylaws of the Human Rights Commission, which works as the ombudsman for the city, right? So I guess the big war was lost, but there were some battles that were actually won. I'm going to move quickly to a second project because I'm already a little bit over the time, and I'll be brief on these ones. The second project is Ecobici, which is the city bike share system, one of the largest in the hemisphere. It's a project that has made compatible multiple agendas, of different actors that are interested in promoting the bicycle, but that have not been able to undo power inequalities between these groups. It's a project that has prioritized global and local visibility over demands for infrastructural redistribution. And it's a project that it's reinforcing existing inequalities and social stigmas. And I'll tell you briefly why. Ecobici is if you visited Mexico City recently, you probably stayed somewhere that's served by Ecobici, but in reality, Ecobici only serves a handful of neighborhoods in the city. And the bicycle, and it's a relatively new, recent project. It just was launched in 2010. However, since the mid-90s or the early 90s, there had been a lot of social mobilization, grassroots groups that were pushing for and demanding bicycle infrastructure in the city. And in very concrete terms, this is the most famous group is Bicitecas, that is actually very well known across the world. The name is great, I think. It combines bicycles and Aztecs. They have been using a lot of contentious politics repertoire for demanding better infrastructure for cyclists. The city had no infrastructure for cyclists at all for many years, so anything would have helped. So one of the things that they do, this is called a die-in. I don't know if you're familiar with this is very much a traditional environmental movement repertoire. You pretend that you're dying to protest. And they came, this is one of those groups that I said that for a long time were mostly located within the environmental movement and have changed their arguments to be more about climate change. So they, without any success, for many years were pushing for transportation infrastructure, for bicycle transportation infrastructure. And the thing that they were demanding concretely was the construction of a 300-kilometer, which is about 200-mile network of bicycle lanes that would serve the whole city. The poor neighborhoods, the middle-class neighborhoods, the rich neighborhoods, everybody would be connected through a bike lane network. That has not happened yet. But it was also important because the mayor at the time, again, Marcelo Ebrard, that was criticized in a couple of slides behind us, was really interested in having a project that would give him a lot of visibility at a global stage. This is one of the mayors, Bloomberg style, that are interested not only just in local politics, but in becoming this big global policy influencers. Right? And he was relatively successful at that. I have a lot on that. I'm going to give you stories, but I love the title of an essay that he wrote and published after he was done with his tenure, just showing that he had done a lot of stuff for environment in the city. The title is great, From Mexico Back to Mexico City. I think I didn't know he had that capacity of writing. But the problem Ebrard was really interested in the bicycle, but one of the problems was that in Mexico City, bicycle has always been associated with the poor. right? Only the poor ride the bicycle because they don't have any other mode of transportation. These are photos from a district in the east end of the city, Iztapalapa. And these are photos that I took of people that are using bicycle as other people use the car to go to work, to transport family. So these are very sustainable and environmentally friendly ways of going about your daily life. However, they don't really match the stories or the narratives that the mayor wanted to push and wanted to be visible for us. So what the mayor did, he created an agency that subsequently hired global experts in urban design, such as the Danish architect Jan Gehl, to make very, very compelling designs and guidelines for the implementation of sustainable transportation policy in Mexico City. Of course, these were really expensive and they couldn't be built across, it was just economically unfeasible to do this across the whole city. So the project of this 300-kilometer network of bike lanes was abandoned, and instead the focus was on constructing a small and targeted network of bike share stations, just as City Bike in New York, with a handful of bike lanes in very concrete neighborhoods in the city. These are neighborhoods like Roma, Polanco, Condesa, that are at the center of a process of revitalization of central Mexico City, that it's where people go when they go from vacation for a long weekend in Mexico. I've seen a lot of tourists there, so it darts through. And the focus has been, of course, to make the bicycle appealing to those that are not using the bicycle at the moment, and these are the middle and the upper classes that use the car, that have the possibility of using the car. So the focus here has been, speaking about narratives again, even though I didn't think I was talk so much about narratives, so I'm doing it. The focus was to resignify the bicycle from something that the poor use to something that cool hipsters and young professionals use. I have one more case, but I'll just give you 2 minutes of this. EcoPark it's a program. It's basically a parking management system. But it has been defined. Parking management. By parking management, I mean electronic parking meters that were not very common in Mexico City up until a few years. And this is a project that the city officials and transportation experts have framed as an environmental friendly project to sustainable transportation, because it was a first step into congestion management, which is something that's very big in New York at the moment. So the idea was, like, if we rationalize and we make expensive to park, people are going to drive less. This is a very straightforward argument. But the project was also, when you look at the politics of it, it was more than just charging for parking. It was a way of getting rid of informal workers, what we call in Mexico City franeleros, which are people that you pay to so that you can park in a street. They don't own the street, but someone own or have captured the capacity of enforcing. Yeah. They'll clean the car if you pay for them, and if you don't pay, who knows what's going to happen to your car. So the discourse was, this is not just about this is not just about environment, but it's also about public space, making sure that people are not using the sidewalks for parking, making sure that we don't have informal workers, that we end circles of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. And this is very good, but the project itself, as I describe here, it's a classical urban planning wicked problem. Yes, there can be many benefits, but the problem is that once you start rationalizing parking, the people that have been living there for a long time are not going to like it, right? Because they have been using the street for a long time. And what happens in some of these neighborhoods, again, I'm thinking about Polanco, Condesa, these central neighborhoods, is that these kinds of projects have exacerbated tensions related to gentrification. Why? Because new residents that live in new buildings have parking for their own cars, so they don't have to worry about it. People that have lived in these neighborhoods, their families have lived in these neighborhoods for 50 years, don't have parking, and they need a place to park. So I'm not necessarily saying that the project was good or bad, although I have my opinions, but what I'm saying is that this really, really brought to surface a lot of tensions. And I'll tell you how the city solved this. And this is going to be the last thing I say. These are photos of the city. These are photos of residents going out in the streets fighting and protesting the implementation of the projects. The city, what they did is that they sided with ITDP, this international NGO, to deploy a set of informational sessions and town hall meetings that in reality were mostly about misinformation or lack of information about the project. And they did not generate any kind of substantial debates about how do we solve the problem, right? For instance, in this slide, they show you, this is the before and after. We did this project before in another neighborhood. At the meeting I went to took place in Colonia Roma. In Polanco, they had done it a few months earlier, and they said, well, this is how it was before and this is how it's after, but we don't really see what time of the day. The picture on the top might have been a Monday. The picture at the bottom could have been a holiday. So there was a lot of misinformation on how this works. And the other thing that happened here is that city officials and international NGO experts were also very dismissive about any other solution to the problem, right? And the truth is that many of the longtime residents argue that the problem was not parking, but zoning and the enforcement of zoning. Like these neighborhoods had gone very quickly from being residential to being business-oriented and places where people go for dinner and get drinks, et cetera. And that was the problem, right? And some of the experts would come up, when you talk to them, would come up with some statements like, for instance, you know, if we know what's better for everybody, and if we let citizens decide, they're going to come up with some crazy ideas about how to deal with public space. At the time, the mayor had implemented something called the playas urbanas, or these beaches that were put for low-income residents that couldn't afford a trip to Acapulco or any other place, so they would go to towns. And this was like the kind of things that terrified transportation experts. You know, this is not public space. Like what we need is rationalized projects. Okay, so those are the three projects that I wanted to show you. I just wanted to say just a couple of things as a way of conclusion. What these projects are showing us is that we need to examine some of the, if you're interested in planning and in the environment, climate change is a very powerful discourse, very powerful narrative, and some actors can get away with a lot of things just by arguing that they're working for the common good. However, if we're interested in questions of democracy and citizenship, we need to look at what are the institutions and geographies that these projects produce and reproduce. How is it that citizens are able to insert their knowledge, the particular expertise in projects, and how do they get to really participate in debates about the low-carbon city? And the one final thing is that if we're thinking about urban citizenship as a way of talking about democracy, but also inequality and difference in the city, thinking about mobility and travel and circulation is more important than ever. Thank you.
Thank you. You made us think a lot about New York City as well. We have a lot of problems with bicycles too, and other problems. All right, so let's move to some questions, answers, comments. I don't know if you have any questions or comments here for the panelists. Yes. Yes, could you please tell us your name and your affiliation or your, yes.
My name is Gail Pellet, and I'm a journalist and documentary filmmaker. I have no affiliation with the
Okay, that's fine.
everything. These were so critically important, these presentations. I'm just wondering what you think, as far as I understand, Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the mayor or president of CityMax, is an environmental scientist. And she may be the only one who's a mayor of a global city of the scale of Mexico City. How has she influenced this since she came? I mean, I understand the Metrobus was an AMLO project when he was there. what is her impact on the city, or what is the current thinking in the framework of your presentations, what you're concerned with public transportation and environmental projects in the city?
Sure. Do you have? Do you want to go first?
Yes.
Do we do more questions or we answer?
Well, it's up to you. Do you want a couple more questions and then we follow up?
Let's do a couple of questions.
Let's see if there are other questions or comments. Yes, go ahead.
Also, very concerned about the environment. In my country, I see that there's a repetition in other Latin American countries do the same thing. This year, I went to my country to make a program. For me to go from one place to another, it was unbelievable, horrible because of the enormous cost. Traveling, I don't care what time I try to do between 9 or 10 or 11 o'clock before the noon because I know at that time it was horrible. And either time that I tried to travel from my sister's house to anyone that I was going to visit, it took me forever. I mean, I think the repetition of this in the city is actually not only Mexico City. Now, if you, with your research and all that, are you planning to bring that all to the government and you're planning to use that to implement some ideas to bring some, to alleviate the situation?
Thank you. Do we have another question or comment? No? Well, if we, oh, yes, in the back, yes.
Hello, my name is Noemi. I'm a student from City College of New York. And my question is for Oscar Sosa. So, you had mentioned that the poor are the ones that use more the bicycles as their form of transportation rather than just a vehicle. So how is this city bike similar program helping the poor? Is there a cost for it? Is there a borrowing you have to give back or you become penalized, or is there a cost? How is this benefiting the poor?
All right, you want to go ahead and try to answer?
Well,
thank you.
All right, thank you for the questions.
Another hand there, right? Yeah, there was somebody else, yeah.
Oh, sorry, yes.
And I'm by professional social worker, retired and so on. My question is for David Lopez. When there was one of the statements that was made is to increase accessibility, and also think we were talking about the capacity. I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember. So it was accessibility, but it was something to do, I guess, with people. So I wanted to know what that meant exactly.
Okay, what's your name again?
Maria.
Maria. All right, thank you.
Okay, there are a couple more questions. Let's wait, and otherwise they're going to forget
All right.
the first.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. Gail, I think that you touch on a very important topic. You see, Claudia Sheinbaum has a long history in the city. She was the Minister of the Environment in the 2000s while all of this Metrobus policy process was happening. She was in charge of the environmental agenda. She is a very renowned environmental scientist. And at the time, the mayor was the current president of the country, Lopez Obrador. And in this time, there were two main infrastructure projects in the city causing a lot of dispute and contestation. One of them was the Metrobus, but the other one was the double-decker system that will build roads on top of other roads in Mexico City. Some of them will be free, but others will have a toll. And surprisingly, this second project, the double-decker highway system, the mayor at the time, Lopez Obrador, put Claudia Sheinbaum in charge of implementing that project. Instead of putting the public infrastructure minister or public works minister in charge of that, she put the environmental minister in charge of that because the rationale was that the double-decker system will be able to ameliorate traffic congestions and therefore improve air quality, right? The next mayor after López Obrador, Ebrard, carried on with this policy of the Metrobús, and now Claudia Sheinbaum is mayor now, and she comes from that political team, right? From López Obrador, from Marcelo Ebrard, this mayor that we saw some of those cartoons in Oscar presentation. And she's resuming this agenda. She's now building the 8th line of Metrobús. So she's still on this agenda under the rationale of that ameliorating the traffic chaos of the city will improve air quality. But, you know, to my surprise, she's also reaching to a new agenda, the agenda of social justice and accessibility, and in a metropolitan scale. Because now, I mean, I still have to go back and like keep analyzing more carefully the narratives of my interviews. But my impression is that the current mayor, Sheinbaum, has the goal of going metropolitan, right? So Mexico City is just one piece of the city comprised of 16 municipalities, but the city is actually 76 municipalities. The other municipalities are from a neighboring state, a different state of Mexico, governed by a different political party. And Claudia Sheinbaum is actually pushing going metropolitan in scale in terms of public transportation. So she's pretty much still on this agenda, I will argue. I will connect that to the question of Maria. By accessibility, I think this is a new agenda that is emerging in the city. This basically, it's coming up in my interviews. I hear more and more the topic of accessibility, and that means many things for different actors. For some, accessibility of public transport means accessibility for people with disabilities, right? For others, it means accessibility for the elder. For others, it means accessibility in terms of gender issues, right? There's the recognition that accessibility of public transport systems is different for different genders. But also increasingly accessibility in terms of affordability and of social justice. That's an agenda that is emerging now. Citizen experts like those that Oscar was talking about, I think that they're picking up on the agenda of accessibility, and they're defining it in different ways, and they're trying to influence the policy process in terms of this accessibility agenda. For them, it also means connecting the systems and making all the different, remember I showed a slide with many different systems. Accessibility also means connecting them. So this is a narrative in construction. This is still being disputed and configured. It's not very clear yet, but it's under dispute. And I connect that to Raul's question. With my work, I'm actually more in this agenda of accessibility, and I'm looking at transportation in a more metropolitan scale and peripheral scale. And to some extent, and don't get angry with me, and we can discuss this, all right? But to some extent, what I'm trying to do is to counter a little bit this narrative of environmental concerns, because yeah, that's fine. Environmental concerns are legit, and that should be a priority, and that's fine. But there's other kinds of things going on in the city that are kind of being obscured by the environmental agenda, and I'm trying to make visible the landscapes of uneven distribution of infrastructural systems, the presence of the state in some areas of the city, and leaving behind other areas of the city. So I think that what I'm trying to do is to put other narratives and other perspectives. I'm trying to destabilize or counter a little bit the narrative that public transport should be a tool for environmental issues. Yeah, it should be that, but it should be something else too. And that's what I'm trying to do with my work, going more to issues of social justice.
Before we say that, you're trying to point out the corruption, the things that at some point, it's being corrupted, there's always someone behind who's pushing for the benefits of a few instead of the whole.
Well, you know, corruption is just like in the DNA of Mexico, right? It's just everywhere. But no, I don't think I'm focusing too much on corruption. I'm thinking more on where the state reaches in a city and the processes behind where the state is able to go and where it's not going. Like, why is the attention of the state center in some places and not in others, right? And I'm trying to understand that process. Yeah, exactly. The distribution of a public good that is called... Exactly, the distribution of transportation as a public good, right? That's what I'm trying to understand. Yeah. All right, thank you. I appreciate the comment.
Professor Sosa?
Yeah, David already gave you a little bit of background on Claudia Sheinbaum, the current mayor and at some point Secretary of the Environment. I did not talk about her in my presentation, but she is, when the book is ready and you get to read it, if you're interested, she's one of the main characters in my story. She, I interviewed her for before she was mayor, which I was lucky I got to her before she took this position, and we talked about the process that happened behind the scenes for the construction of the first bus rapid transit system in Mexico. And I'm not going to get into that because that would be another couple of hours of me talking nonstop. But the one thing I would say is that if I just describe expert citizens as a new category of political actor in Mexico City, I could describe her as a bureaucrat expert, as a different kind of category of actor that has been central to reforms in Mexico. She was not only very close to Lee Shepard and very high level climate scientists, and she was able to leverage that expertise in the process of managing the implementation of the bus rapid system, leveraging money from the World Bank, from Shell Foundation, from all these different institutions. But she was also very close and very close in the inner circle of then Mayor Lopez Obrador. And she was able to work both sides very well. And I would say, and my argument in my book is that we cannot understand the success that all these actors have had in promoting sustainable transportation projects if you don't look at how this character was able to frame very technical reforms and make them compatible with I would say technocratic reforms with very populist demands from the mayor and from a variety of factors, including bus drivers. This is a story that's perhaps a little too focus on bus rapid transit system, but you just put it in more general terms. She represents some of the contradictions in the construction of sustainable transportation policy. So when Noemi was asking me whether this is doing something for the poor or not, if the bike share system is doing something for the poor, I don't think it's doing much, because the construction of these projects, the different agendas that has been necessary to reconcile for the implementation of sustainable transportation have been reconciled in a way that leave all these different gaps, right? So you want people to ride the bicycle, but then you need to ignore the ones that ride the bicycle the most if they're poor, because you want different kinds of factors to come in. And I'm not saying that she was necessarily participant in that kind of decision, but it is part of a series of dynamics that are out there that are where environment, and that's how I ended up my presentation. Environmental sustainability, climate change is a very powerful narrative and very powerful discourse, and it means many things for many different. I mean, we could have over here 45 different definitions of climate change and climate crisis, and everybody would focus on something else. So the question is, how is it that officials and experts and civil society are actually coming together in designing projects? That I think is related to Raul in terms of Raul's question, policy recommendations. The recommendations that I have, even though my research is not necessarily one that makes a lot of them, my recommendation for policy making is to number one, to I guess, in a slightly different take than David, we need to delink environmental effects from social effects, but attend to both at the same time. Right? And I think the only way you can do that is by implementing very, very, very profound, and this applies to the United States too, and New York, very, very profound reforms. We really get to the question of where are the roots of inequality in cities, and that requires a lot of work and a lot of time. And what I've seen in Mexico and in other cities in Latin America and even in the US, thinking of City Bike, is that mayors and officials are more concerned with rapid results and a lot of visibility, a lot of flashiness, and going that route, and environmental crises also kind of tells us that we need to act really quickly and we need solutions fast. I'm not saying that we don't need solutions fast, but that's why these are wicked problems, right? We need to find a way to address the immediate concerns, but at the same time constructing the reforms that we need so that we can get to the deeper and more costly and more time-consuming transformations that I think we need, you know? And so a lot of the people that are talking about climate justice today are talking about these issues, right? So this is I think these are examples on the ground that could illustrate very well the complexities of that idea of climate.
Can we take some more questions? Because otherwise we will never end. Yeah. Another set of questions, and then, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering that, because it seems to me that in Mexico City, a lot of people use the subway, which is very sustainable and environmental, and I don't know, I came in halfway through your presentation, but I don't know if either of you is considering that system in your research, and how you fit that in, or if you're just focusing on these new sort of projects. Yeah.
Yes.
Something that I find would be useful for both of your presentations, given that most of us probably have a somewhat superficial understanding of CDMX, is about the economic players. Many major urban areas have such economic interests that are often counter to public interests, including the use of public space. And that needs to be clarified in light of the climate crisis that we're in today, specifically in such areas as emergency management. This city, because it has no plans due to the flooding of Brooklyn and Queens, will be looking at between 650 and 800,000 people that will need emergency housing when a flood comes from a Hurricane 1 or 2 category. In this city, city planning is not city planning, it's zoning. All they really do is zoning because of economic interest. So I think it would help to understand the dynamics behind both of your presentations, which are really good analytically, to know how the economic powers confront what is essentially a populist government for the last 20 years.
Question. The first one is with regards to those, you mentioned that it's already starting to create the 8th line. So have you seen expansion towards providing more accessibility to the lower income community, or is it still centralized in the upper class community? And the second one is about the via that was mentioned, that was constructed. I don't know, but have you, Dr. Sosa, seen that it's proven effective in reducing the congestion and reducing carbon emissions? And does that, in your opinion, outweigh the cons of going over the natural reserves
All right, thank you for the great questions. So let me answer your question.
Yes,
your
I'm
name?
sorry, I didn't. I know his name, but go ahead.
Peter, thank you. Let me answer Peter's questions by jumping into the conversation also with Oscar. Yeah, that's a great remark. I really appreciate that. And I want to put a nuance to what I was saying earlier and to the comment of Raul of my work, kind of being like a counter to this narrative of climate change. I think what I'm trying to say is that what I think is going on is that this narrative of environmental expertise, it's being used to advance policy solutions that to some extent reinforce, reproduce and reinforce current social inequalities in the city. And I think that a key to understand that is exactly some economic players. That you are right, I think I should put that into the presentation. Just as an example, in the creation of the first line of Metrobus, the bus owners of the concession system, those were economic players in itself. Those players managed a huge amount of wealth, because transportation needs in the city, it's huge, so that's a huge amount of wealth, and they had veto power. They could veto these with one hand tied to the back. But the government was able enough to negotiate with them this public-private partnership so that they could keep their business. Another example of economic power there was the decision of where to put the line, the first line, because there were, at some point, it was boiled down to two alternatives. One alternative will run through an avenue, and to answer your question, what was your name, sorry? Gerardo's questions. One option was to put the first line in an avenue that is called Ermitis Tapalapa. That's the name of the avenue, but that will actually connect the city center with one of the most poorer parts of the city, right, and lacking public transit infrastructure. But the decision of placing that in Avenue Insurgentes, which is one of the main avenues of the city, to some extent, and this is a finding from other scholars, Professor Onésimo Flores, who wrote some articles about this. He was a postdoc in Harvard. He argues that the government decided to put the line in Insurgentes to make a political statement to say, we're going for real against climate change and improving the quality of air. Look, we're putting this infrastructure in our main avenue, the main hub of economic activity. And there's some researchers now in Mexico City trying to understand the effect of this decision in economic activity in the zone, because most likely, and there's people researching this, but most likely the value of real estate skyrocketed in that area. There's a lot more of economic units and economic activity, and that decision of putting the infrastructure there reinforced the patterns of economies of agglomeration in that area. So yeah, there's a lot of things to think about of economic power. And getting back to Gerardo's questions, Line 8, it's actually going through Ermitis Tapalapa, is actually now connecting this eastern zone of the city that lacks a lot of public transit infrastructure, and that was a decision made by Claudia Sheinbaum. She had to push forward that decision. So that's when I mean that this thinking of accessibility, it's slowly emerging in the city. And yeah, I will argue that this 8th line, it's actually connecting a zone of the city that was being left behind in terms of transit infrastructure. So that's improvement in terms of my work, right?
Yeah. Let me see, what are the questions? The subway. I did not study the subway. And the reason I did not study it is not because I'm only focusing on new projects in terms of how shiny new they are, but because these projects that I did study, the ones that I show you, plus the bus rapid transit system as well, were done under different logics and politics, right? So the metro, though it's fundamental for Mexico City, it's basically a federal project. The local government manages it, but the money and the politics, historically, with some exceptions, for instance, in recent years with the implementation of the last metro line, the golden, the 12 line, there's some decisions that were made by the mayor at the time, but it's kind of the old school politics that, even though they're still important, I was interested in looking at the new school politics. That's not to say that the metro is not important, and it actually requires a lot of attention today for not just financial attention, but research needs to be done on it. It's a shame that it has gone it's been underfunded for so long. In terms of economic players, yes, I agree. I agree with you. My presentation should have more of that. I focus more on the discourse of expertise and different ways of mobilizing ideas of sustainability than some of the economic issues were there, maybe not as visible as to satisfy more critical political economy eyes. But the question of, for instance, the Supervia project, some of the claims were that this was a project that was going to benefit developers, right? So these are economic actors that have been around for a long time. Before they were arguing for other things, now they want sustainable toll roads. The question of where to locate the bike share system is also not just about making the bicycle appealing to middle classes, but it's not just about, it is about that, but how you do that, you locate those in those areas that are already attracting middle classes that are going, places that are going, undergoing economic revitalization. The question of rationalizing public spaces and traffic management is also a project that could be linked to real estate, gentrification, etc. So I think the economics are there. There are another level of economics that we didn't talk about. The whole push towards sustainable transportation projects has generated a new economy, the mobility economy. Now we're seeing investment actors, investment capital, and people that are selling new mobility solutions that are making, the Lime bicycles, the dockless bikes, and the scooters, and a variety of other private actors that are moving into transportation policy, selling solutions that some are actually solutions or are not so much, but there's definitely sustainable transportation it has become a space for capital to be reproduced by a very small number of actors. But I try to stay away from those more structural capitalist-centric approaches for now, but I'll be happy to talk about those more. Is Supervia efficient or effective? I don't think so. I don't have the numbers to tell you, but the project itself does, and these were the critiques that were done by experts in the past, that it didn't do anything to solve the congestion in the city. As if you said, we're going to make the Queensboro Bridge a toll road both ways, and that's going to solve congestion in New York, right? So the scale of the project, even though it's very important for those that are affected by it, when you zoom out and look at the whole city, it was very minimal. And like many of these projects, and related to what I said before, these piecemeal projects are going to have very little and limited effect if they're not part of larger structural reforms that could have the capacity of really aligning different objectives and problems and mechanisms for reducing congestion or increasing redistribution or any other progressive agenda that you want to carry forward.
There are also the policies of the hoy no circula, the fact that people that can afford to have two cars and they use the two cars.
Yeah, that's a classic case.
So that's you know, so that if there is no traffic, people use two cars as opposed to one, a family, right? So that's also problematic, no? Well, I would love to keep listening to your questions and your answers, but I think we have to end now. Of course, you can approach the panelists and come and introduce yourselves and ask more questions if you have. And I would like to thank you for coming during this very busy time. Very provocative, your presentations, and we can relate a lot to that here in New York City. We have a lot of problems with bicycles, a lot of accidents. I just had one not long ago because a tourist just rented a bike and he just decided to go in front of me. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you.